Hi weaving friends, today we're going to be talking about sampling, what a sample is, why I would want to do it, and various ways in which I can go about sampling. So in my early days of weaving, I used to hear and read about people sampling on warps, and I used to think, what a ridiculous idea. You spend all of that time warping up for a little sample, wasting all of that yarn when you can just jump right in and go ahead with the project. Well, friends, I've learned an awful lot since then, and you could safely call me a sampling convert. So what is a sample? Well, in its most basic form, it's a piece of fabric that you weave on your loom, and it could be anything really. It's whatever you set it up to be. This is a sample right here, and it has a variety of different pickup techniques on it. So for this particular sample, this was a way for me to try out different patterns, different yarns with a pickup stick on my rigid heddle loom. But you can sample absolutely anything that you want to. So how do you go about sampling? Well, when I think of sampling, I think there are probably three main ways that you would go about it. The first one is a dedicated warp, where you warp up with the intention of weaving a particular pattern or a particular style with a particular yarn at a particular set. So it's basically you want to try out for a future project, or maybe you're just curious and you just want to see what is going to happen when I combine this color yarn with this color yarn. Or maybe you're testing an animal fiber with a plant fiber and you're just not quite sure how the two are going to react, and so you want to weave a sample and then you want to go right through the wet finishing process and see what sort of fabric that you get. I quite often warp my looms with a dedicated sampler warp, and a loom like this little Sampleit here is absolutely perfect for doing this because I can literally warp this loom in under 10 minutes. And also I don't use it for much else. It's not like I'm having to take up space on another one of my looms with a sample. I do like to do a dedicated warp for a sample like this one that I showed you already, because it really gives me a lot of freedom for trying out a lot of different methods on one warp, depending on the loom of course. But even if you say warped up your table or your floor loom with a sampler, you're still at least going to be trying out a few different treadlings on the one warp if you want to. So you still have that flexibility. Obviously on a rigid heddle loom, you have a lot more flexibility because you often thread up for plain weave, and then you can use your pickup sticks or your heddle rods or whatever you're going to do, all your colors and that sort of thing to try out, and you're not committed to a certain type of threading. On the other hand, you may warp up your rigid heddle loom with 2 heddles, 3 heddles, heddle rods, pickup sticks, and all of that to try out a particular pattern or a combination of patterns. The only difference with that being that if you've got the 2 or 3 heddles, then you're committed to the threading that you've undertaken. If you've got heddle rods or pickup sticks, you can take them off and change them out. So that can be a great option too. So remember little old beginner me weaver who said, why on earth would anyone waste time and yarn in sampling? Well, I've had the benefit of years of weaving since then, and also the benefit, if you want to look at it that way, of making a lot of mistakes. And I've learned a lot from my mistakes, and I've found that doing a sample for a new project, for a new yarn, for trying out a pattern that I may not have tried before, it becomes like an insurance policy, and it allows your outcome to be really very predictable. So because I have been weaving for years, and I've got a lot of my favorite yarns that I tend to stick with in my favorite colors, and I have a lot of my favorite patterns as well, I'm at the point now where I don't need to sample as often because I am aware of what the results are probably going to be, because I repeat a lot of the same things, yarns, patterns, etc. over and over. But there are plenty of times, and especially if I'm designing for a new pattern or for a new class, I have to ensure before I start recording all of my results, before I start filming anything, doing all the photography and all of that, I have to make sure that what I'm going to weave is going to work out very well and translate very well for students. And so sampling for me is a great time investment, even though it takes me extra time at the beginning of a project before I start. It's going to save me time later on, because when I come to the project, I'm going to have predictable results because I've been through the whole process without committing to a full project. Now, I was talking about the ways to go about sampling. So the first one was the dedicated warp. The next one is you can warp up for whatever project it is you want to do, and you can weave however much you want at the beginning of the warp. So you would allow for this in your warp calculations. You'd put in the extra, and you weave that extra little part at the start, and then you actually cut that off, retie your warp onto the front, and take the little part that you have already woven and do your wet finish and everything to see how that turns out. Now, this can be a good option just to make sure before you go ahead with the full project. The only problem with this is that you've already begun the project. You've already committed those threads to whatever heddles they're in, to whatever pattern they're in, to whatever spacing they're in. But the main benefit with this kind of sampling at the beginning is, say you weren't too sure about the set. You felt like maybe you were gambling a little bit on making the set so far apart. And then when you wet finished your sample, you found that indeed your set was a little bit far apart. Well, then you haven't gone too far into your project yet to be able to reslay the reed in a closer set or something like that. So that's the second method of sampling, and in my opinion, not the most ideal. And then the third method of sampling is you already have a warp on the loom and you are at the end of your project and you have some extra warp. This is usually calculated for beforehand as well, but sometimes you might have a little bit more warp left over than you anticipated. That gives you the opportunity to try something out at the end of the warp. This could be really good for trying out a new yarn, like if you're combining say you have a tencel warp and you want to combine it with a heavier wool weft. You can do that at the end of that project and see how it turns out and treat that as its own sample and wet finish it and then see what you've got at the end. So that's the third way of sampling. The first method of sampling is definitely my favorite with its own dedicated warp, but I realized that that can be quite a bit more yarn, and so you have to be willing to use a bit of yarn just to see how it's going to turn out. I also see this as a real investment, not just in the long-term project, that I know that the project's going to turn out well afterwards, but also in my own learning processes, because when you have a dedicated sampler warp on, you can try so many things that often the things that I try, I just think of them as I go along. And I'll be weaving away and I'll be like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I tried this yarn in here, or if I changed the pickup a little bit here, or if I tried this combination of colors here. So it gives you that kind of real freedom just to play. I sort of think of them as play warps really, because you can do a lot and you can just come up with these unexpected things and then end up using them later in projects as well. Now I have a whole box full of my own samples from the past 5 years of making classes and making designs. It would take me a really long time to go through them with you all. I do have inside the members section of the online weaving school, I do have a video that takes you through a lot of the samples in my workbox. Even for that one, I had to cut it short because there were just so many. So what I've done today is I've just taken out a few key examples of why I think sampling is such a good idea. The first one is I want to talk about the scale of a pattern. So here I have 3 pieces that are very similar in pattern, especially these 2. This one is a little different, but I think it's still pretty relevant to what I'm talking about. So for this first piece, these 3 are all done on a rigid heddle loom. This first piece has a black warp with all hand-dyed, hand-spun weft. And you can see that it's the warp that's making the pattern. And although you can see the pattern in a lot of the parts of it, of the scarf, it is a little bit obscured. It looks like a very textured piece just because there's so much color going on behind it. Here, right next to it, is the same pattern with the same warp, but with a solid weft background. And the pattern on here, even though it's the exact same pattern, it looks kind of bigger here, and it has more of an impact because it really stands out on that plain weave background. So without sampling, it would be hard to kind of visualize this sort of thing, because especially if you're using like a hand spun yarn, you can't necessarily visualize exactly how that's going to look in a project. So sampling would be a great option here. Now, this cushion that I've got here, and this is from the Pick Up Perfection class, also on a rigid heddle loom. It has a similar pattern to these two in that it's a diamond shape, except here on this one it's warp floats, this is warp floats, and here we are focusing more on the weft floats. But as I said, it's relevant because it's a similar pattern, but look at the difference in scale. These diamonds are really huge compared to these diamonds, and I've used them in a different kind of design and everything. But it's just really interesting to think of the scale of a pattern. So what's going to change the scale of a pattern? Well, obviously I've spaced it out with this one. I've made it weft floats instead of warp floats, but also I've used a much thicker yarn. So here I've got a DK weight yarn in this entire cushion, and here I've got a fingering weight yarn. Same with here. The hand spun weft was a little bit heavier than fingering weight, but as far as the warp goes, that was all fingering weight. And so when I change the thickness of the yarn, most of the time I'm also changing the set to be further apart. So for example, this might be a set of 10 and this one might be a set of 7.5. And these are the kind of things that sampling will make very obvious to me, so that I don't have to try to always imagine how something is going to look or how the scale of something is going to change. For this next sample, I was trying out some Leno, and I've certainly done plenty of Leno before, so that I know that it's fairly predictable for me. However, this time I changed something a lot. I did some stripes in the warp. So you can see I've got some pink and I've got some navy, and I wanted to kind of combine that with other colors just to see what I personally thought of Leno with multiple colors. So here I used a light blue weft, and just scrolling through, you can see I varied the repeats. So sometimes the repeats were closer together and sometimes they were further apart, as you can see here. But if I go back to the beginning, something that is really worth sampling for is when you are using a weave structure that is going to have draw-in, more draw-in than your usual plain weave that you might be used to doing. So the draw-in is, imagine that this is the warp, vertical, it's how far the threads come in together compared to the original width on the loom. So originally this one was 6.5 inches width on the loom, and here it's shrunk to 4 inches. So these kind of things are things that you won't really know until you try them. And you can see here for this particular part, it's shrunk so much smaller, and it's a very stretchy fabric and very open, compared to up here where it hasn't shrunk as much and it's a little bit stretchy but not as much. And so when I'm doing a sampler warp like this, you can clearly see the different sections where I've tried out different things. So I just want to take notes of what I've done in each section. So I could call this section 1, section 2, section 3, and so on, and write those things down, exactly the steps that I did, to make them repeatable for later on if I want to do them. Now, one of the main things that this warp showed me was that I do not like, personally, my opinion, I don't like multiple colors in Leno, and I probably won't be using it in a project anytime soon. I do kind of like this because I just like the texture. I like the way the texture stands out. But the rest of it, you know, I could leave it. So there's another important point about sampling. It shows you your own likes and dislikes. I'm so happy to have these samples to show you because they really illustrate my point when talking about samplers. These are a few double width samplers and they're from fairly recent times. You might recognize this blanket from my double width blanket ebook that's available on Etsy. And by the way, any of these projects that I talk about, whether they're classes, designs, whatever they are, I will try to link to them all down below in case you want to take a closer look. So this is my finished blanket, which turned out quite beautifully, but I sampled quite extensively for this design before I started. And the reason I did that is because my design that I had pre-planned for it, once I actually wove that design in a sampler, I found for several reasons that it didn't work the way I wanted it to. Let me show you the little sampler. So this is it here. And you can see it's really not that big. It doesn't need to be, but my fold was here. Okay, so I'm folding it out so that you can see it. So it showed me several things. Let's see. Yeah, I want to show you both sides. So what happened was I had, on this design, my yellow squares were more like rectangles. So they became quite elongated that way. And I had, in my original design, I had the idea that I really wanted a yellow stripe running down the middle of the fold, which is what I did. And it turned out to be very problematic because, well, number one, my fold just didn't look all that pleasing. There's a bit of a ridge here. I'm not sure if you can see it in the video, but I can definitely feel the ridge of that fold right there. And the yellow thread is quite prominent. And then, turning it over, you can see on this side, there is no yellow line down the middle. So this is the middle fold right here. So what this sample taught me, particularly on this side, is that having the yellow placed in that spot on the fold actually drew attention to the fold. And if you've tried double width weaving, you're probably aware that one of the most crucial things is that you want to get the fold right. You want the fold to be as invisible as possible. You don't actually want it to be a feature of the piece. Now, I was a little bit sad when I wove this and saw that it wasn't going to work because I really liked this design. You can see I tried a couple of different designs here. Here I had wider blocks and here I had thinner blocks. So thinner repeats of the weft. And I really liked both of them and I just thought, oh, that's so sad that I can't weave it exactly as I wanted to. And then I had to brainstorm what else could I do instead. I wanted to keep this basic design with these colours because I thought they worked really fabulously well. So what I ended up doing, let's go back to the actual project. If you look at the fold here, I moved any yellow stripes away from the fold and made a block around it and repeating blocks. And I made it so that there's grey running horizontally and grey running vertically, and it shows enough in each direction that it matches with the ones on the other sides that are doing the same thing. I'll just turn it over so we can have a look at the other side. And again here you can see the little bit of grey, but it doesn't attract your eyes to the fold straight away, which is what I wanted. So I was able to keep my design. I also got it a little bit more square, so squared up these parts, which I think is more visually pleasing. If we go back again to this sample that is more rectangular than square. So I actually ended up with a piece that I was much happier with, but I wouldn't have known that if I didn't first do this sample that didn't work out so well. Okay, now this piece, when I started designing for my double width on a floor loom class, This is the pattern that I really wanted to use. In fact, I had my heart set on it. When I warped it up, it turned out quite differently to what I anticipated. So let's have a look again at the fold. This is where my fold line was, and this is my first part of weaving here and here going up to here. So this is a yarn that I've used extensively. In fact, I use it all the time, so I felt that I knew it extremely well, and I was quite confident that I had the correct set, and it was all just going to be so, so wonderful. So when I started weaving, I'll fold it out so you can see the fold. When I started weaving this part, I was like, hey, hang on, where is the pattern that is supposed to be here? This just looks like a kind of a jumble of weft with some little warp parts peeking through here and there. This is not what I signed up for. That's what I was thinking. And also, you know, my fold was not that great either. It's very loose at the fold, so there's a lot of weft showing. So I thought, okay, that's weird, but I'm going to change my weft and keep trying. So this was my weft change. And as you can see, it's not very different to the original grey. There is just way too much weft in here, and it's very packed in. And I was thinking, well, that's really strange because I'm not beating any harder than I normally would. And so then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try a softer beat. So I tried a softer beat, and thankfully the actual pattern that I wanted to see did begin to emerge. Still not looking as bold as I would like, but at least it did emerge. And then I tried some more weft yarns, and as you can see, it's still too loose at the fold. And we'll keep going because it does get better. It gets better as you go along. And try another different weft, and then get to the black weft, and then I'm like, wow, finally I can see a bit of boldness about this pattern. It looks exactly how it's supposed to look. So the problem was, and when you feel this, it feels absolutely gorgeous. Like, it's so soft and it's so flowy. It's just really lovely for a blanket. But the fact is, I set it way too wide apart. And that was why the pattern wasn't showing, because my weft was, even though I wasn't beating that hard, my weft was packing in. It was obscuring the warp because I'd set it too far apart, and that's why my fold was also looking weird, why I seemed to have so much weft yarn at the fold, like here, because the threads at the fold were set too far apart as well. The whole thing was just too airy. Okay, so I finished that sample and I took it off the loom, and by then I thought, okay, I could still use this for a blanket, but I would want to do another sampler just to make sure, increasing the set to make sure it was it was going to turn out right for my project. So instead, I decided to change patterns, and I did increase the set, and this time it turned out much better, except I still had problems, which will become evident to you. Let's see, here's the fold. Hang on, that way. The fold is that way. Yeah. Okay, so the patterns look quite good. It is quite attractive. The colours are good. Very nice. I tried a few different treadlings to make sure that they all worked, and they did. But then when I folded it out, when I got it off the loom, oh dear, terrible fold. What a terrible fold. Actually, it's not that terrible. It just looks terrible. I mean, it's not that terrible as in I didn't do that badly with it, but it's just very obvious what I did do. So on this side, you can see that these little weft bumps are really sitting up. Basically, I was just way too loose with the fold at the edge, and I felt like I wasn't being too loose at the fold, but this sampler absolutely taught me that for this particular pattern, with this particular wool, on that particular loom, on that number of shafts, you know, all of the things that combined to make this sample, that I needed to be a little bit tighter with the weft tension at the fold. And turn it over. And you can see again, it doesn't look quite so bad at this side, but you can still see very clearly the fold, and that wasn't what I wanted. So this second sampler also taught me a lot. And then we come to the actual finished project when I actually got around to weaving it, and it turned out beautifully. This is, I decided to do it in just one pattern, the first pattern, but in the class I give students options for 3 different pattern variations. But I really love this one. It's an M&W threading, and it turned out so great. But I'm so glad that I did not 1 but 2 samples before I actually started this, because it told me everything I needed to know to be able to make this beautiful blanket. And so for me, it was well worth the time and the money investment of weaving those 2 samplers first, because I was able to teach myself so much through doing that, and I ended up with a project that I absolutely love. And now if I wanted to weave more of these, however more I wanted to weave of this particular project, I know that it would turn out pretty much the same every time because of what the samplers taught me to do to make it turn out beautifully. So friends, what do you think? Are you already a sampler convert like me? Do you need a little bit more convincing? Are you going to give it a try? Or are you adamant that sampling is not for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And don't forget that all the links that I've mentioned from today will be down below. Just click on more if you can't see them. And until next time, happy weaving.